when Jerusalem fell,
Yes.
and that was the bit. And I went up to the British Museum. I could lose myself for days with the books and with the exhibits and with that. And it was so exciting because this really did encourage my faith.
Yeah.
And then, of course, once you then get on to as you were saying there, to the evidences for Jesus, and see what was actually said about him and see what actually happened. It's amazing, and it really does. It brings the Bible to life, and it's so encouraging. But I guess, do you think in churches enough is we're encouraged enough to get out there and do that, or are we just coming on Sunday, listening to the sermon and going home? Do you think we are encouraged enough?
It's really hard to generalise about other people's churches, isn't it?
But I'm trying to make you.
Yeah. And I also don't want to, because my husband's a church leader, I know there are so many dimensions, aren't there, to the church.
Absolutely.
One of the things we've been thinking and praying about, though, recently is about how just increasingly over the last few years, there's been an encouragement to view the church as a womb into which we come and we receive food and nutrition and we grow, but it's basically internally focused. And, a womb is a place where people grow, that is true, but that's for a purpose, to be
and for
born.
A time.
And yes. And one of the phrases my husband's been talking about is we need to move from having a predominantly womb mentality, which is also a very feminised version of the church, which might be why, men struggle to engage with it, into more of a warrior mentality. That's not to say we want to take up arms and kill people, but it's to say that we're engaged in a spiritual battle. And that as the Christian church, we are not entirely internally focused. We are actually trying to take ground for the Lord and reach people and rescue them out of darkness and out of the grip of darkness. And so I think apologetics is a part of that. It's a part of focusing on those who are outside of our reaches. Now, I passionately believe we need to mentor and nurture new believers and inner healing and all of that. We really believe in that. We're in Peckham. We really need it. But that isn't the goal of the church.
Right.
The goal of the church is to make disciples and to actually grow and extend the kingdom of God on earth. So, it's something we've been thinking about, and I think it's something we need to encourage one another in, and that we can constantly grow in ourselves. I was just listening to a lecture last week by a guy that I work with called Dr. John Lennox, who has debated Richard Dawkins. He's a great ambassador for the Christian faith against the new atheism. And he was speaking about the question of suffering, and he just said one phrase which I'd never heard before. I've been doing this professionally for 13 years, and it was about the question of why does God allow earthquakes, after everything that had just happened in Haiti. And he talked a lot about different answers, but one of the things he said was that in order for the earth to be life permitting, we need to have earthquakes for there to be the correct mineral component of the sea and the air and all of that we have to have earthquakes. It's part of the design of the earth. And he just sort of stopped there and went off and talked about something else. Now, that then triggered in my mind, my goodness, this is a massive question, but actually in Japan, in America, we have the technology as the human race to build houses which can withstand earthquakes. So the issue isn't, God, why have you allowed an earthquake to happen? Shouldn't the issue be, why have we, as human beings, not done something about the poverty of these people who live in an earthquake zone when we have the technology to do something about it?
Yes.
It's like the question of famine and world hunger or preventable diseases, that actually it comes back to us and to our sin, and we so desire to blame God for it.
Yes.
Without asking the question, why haven't we done something about it? just found that it was an absolute revelation to me.
Yes.
So I was thinking about that and repenting and thinking about what we as a church can do about that.
Yeah, and of course blaming God is one of the biggest things, isn't it? That people do, that they're moving on in their life and God doesn't play too much part maybe in their every. As soon as a disaster happens or something very close to home, I found so many of the people that have asked the question, why doesn't God stop the evil, actually are saying, why didn't God stop this one thing in my life?
Yeah.
But whatever the reason, they suddenly then start blaming God.
Yeah.
Do you have ways of sort of asking questions, turning that around in a general way to get them away from the fact of blaming God and of seeing that God actually cares? How do you deal with that sort of area?
Gosh, that's such a massive question.
I know,
it's a brilliant
it is.
question. Well, I think depending on how personal the tragedy that someone's going through is, I think if it's a personal tragedy, then actually the answer is to embrace that person and be there and walk through it with them.
And of course that's why you need to find out, isn't it? Because otherwise
you need to find out how personal it is. I think if it is an intellectual question about suffering, though, there are a few good questions we can ask. One of them is, when things are going well, do you feel that it's right that people should thank God more then? Because if you want to blame him for what's wrong, how about thanking him for what's good? I think another sort of route is that if there is no God, so if we're looking at things from an atheist perspective and there is no God, then good and evil as categories are not really sustainable. What do I mean by that? If there's no God, there is no moral lawgiver. There's no judge ultimately between good and evil. And good and evil are just my personal preference versus your personal preference. This is what Richard Dawkins believes. Mm-hmm. In which case, a few thousand people dying on the other side of the world is the survival of the fittest. That is the Earth's mechanism for, there being less population. The Earth can't sustain the population there is. So, who are we to even ask that question? It's only if human life has essential dignity and worth rooted in the image of God that this question actually makes sense. If we're just animals like every other animal, why do we care? Lions don't care if other lions are killed on the other side of the world. It's because of the image of God that we passionately care when humans die. And it's because God exists that we can look at something and say, that wasn't just distasteful to me personally, in a kind of relativistic way, or that wasn't just illegal, i.e. a country said that it wasn't lawful to do. That was actually wrong. You see, often people say, well, we don't need God to tell us what's right or wrong. We can determine what's right or wrong. And that's how societies have done it. We develop our laws or whatever. Right. But at the Nuremberg trials, when the SS guards were being tried for what they'd done in the camps, their defence was exactly that. Yes. They said these people were German citizens, they were German soldiers in the army, and they were just following orders. They were obeying commands given to them by the democratically elected government of Germany. Mm-hmm. In other words, what they did was legal. How can you say it's wrong? Yes. And it's amazing, if you read the Nuremberg trials, at one point, the prosecuting lawyer, having heard this from the defence multiple times, got up, threw his hand up to heaven and said, is there not a law above our own laws? In other words, it doesn't satisfy to say morality is evolved by human beings